I have ADHD.
I have ADHD.
I have ADHD.
I have ADHD.
ADHD is a misfiring of the brain. It does not allow you to stay focused for the most part when you need to be paying attention. It also can cause you to hyperfocus when you don't want to, which is why people sometimes say that you don't have ADHD because, look, you can sit 4 hours on a video game. Boys, mostly in school. So typically, school is where it's first diagnosed, and it's because they're not paying attention or they're disrupting the class. So people are going to say, oh, he's probably ADD. I believe it is, yes. I find that ADD itself has not really gotten that much more prevalent, but parents are not teaching their kids. So you're seeing more diagnoses when actually I don't think a lot of it is true ADD. I think it's a huge problem in that parents will tell their child that, well, things are harder for you because you have ADD. And so the child then begins to believe that maybe they can't do it because of their ADD. Rather than trying, they just go with the ADD thing and not give it that their all that they could do. And at some point, there were always the expectations for kids, and back in the 50s, 60s, 70s, there were still kids with ADD. They were called hyperactive, but there were expectations for them. We expect you to do better. These days, parents don't. They just say, well, he's ADD. So because they don't expect the child to it, the way they address the child, the way they treat the child is not the same as they would for any other child. The child knows this. Kids understand this instinctively, that they're not as good as everybody else. And that, in their head, it's said, I'm not as good as everybody else. And they're never going to be able to reach their full potential. These kids need to learn how to structure and learn how to structure themselves. But if they're not getting any structure from their parents or from their educators or anybody else, then they just assume nobody really cares because I'm ADD. They're not working with me. They're not showing me what I need to do. They've given up. And so the kid will give up on themselves.
pharmaceutical companies can influence healthcare providers' choice of medication. And depending on the relationship that the healthcare provider has with a particular pharmaceutical company, whether they realize it or not, they might be actually primed to think more about ADHD because this pharmaceutical company just came and visited and took them out to lunch and gave them a bunch of pens and notebooks that has their drug name written all over it. So even though as healthcare providers we try to avoid these biases and interfering with our assessment, we're human and it's going to happen whether we are aware of it or not. So I think just pharmaceuticals can sometimes prime healthcare providers by bringing this idea of ADHD to the forefront, even because you have so many cues in your environment that remind you of that, which in turn can lead to errors on the part of healthcare providers when they're diagnosing. So it's a big issue. We certainly have seen an increase in the percentage of individuals diagnosed with ADHD, and this is why I think a thorough assessment is so important, because many of us, probably all of us at some point, have experienced inattention or perhaps hyperactivity, but that doesn't mean that we have ADHD. There are a lot of reasons why someone might be inattentive or hyperactive. So for example, somebody might have an anxiety disorder, and so that in turn makes them very inattentive because they are constantly worrying, they're in their own head. And so if we don't do a good assessment, we might just look at that surface symptom, which is inattention, and think, oh, well, they must have ADHD inattentive type. But really the root cause is something else. It's really the anxiety disorder. So we need to treat the anxiety disorder and the inattention goes away. So I think a good assessment is really important in helping us distinguish, is the inattention or hyperactivity a symptom of some other underlying disease, or is it truly caused by ADHD, which is a neurological condition? Typically, we are looking for the person to meet all of the diagnostic criteria outlined in the DSM. So some of the ways we can do this, we certainly want to meet the person that's suspected of having ADHD. So if it's a child, we want to interview them. We want to observe him or her in school, at home if possible. We also want to talk with parents and other caregivers in that person's life, especially if they are a child, because kids aren't always the best reporters, so we might want to interview the teacher, coaches, nannies, babysitters, etc., parents for sure. There are also objective tests of attention that we can give. So these are cognitive tests. A lot of them are done on a computer and allows us to score a child's performance and compare their performance to other kids, which can kind of give us a sense of what their attention is like. Rating scales are also commonly used. So we might have, depending on the age of the child can rate themselves, the parents can rate the child, the teacher can rate the child, and then we get a nice overall picture of what does this child's behavior look like across multiple settings. Because one of the things we're looking for ADHD is the symptoms have to be evident in more than just one setting in order for it to be considered a disorder. So for example, if a child is strictly inattentive or hyperactive at school but not at home, it's probably not ADHD. It's probably something environmental. So we give those rating scales to ensure that the symptoms are truly present across multiple settings. In terms of overdiagnosis too, I think we need to teach the general population and educators, anyone who works with children and adults, everybody actually, about the dangers of overdiagnosis, about how there are a variety of conditions that could lead to inattention and hyperactivity. That doesn't necessarily mean one has ADHD. There could be something else causing that inattention and hyperactivity. So we have to do a really, really thorough assessment to rule out all those different causes that could be producing those symptoms. So I think education is really key. Teaching parents, teachers, and kids themselves of all ages, adolescents, young adults, about other conditions that can look like ADHD but aren't. As psychologists, we get that kind of training because oftentimes we're the ones doing this kind of diagnosing. And if you look in the DSM, there is actually, for every diagnosis, there's a whole differential diagnosis section, which basically tells the provider, look, here are some other diagnoses that can look like ADHD, but you have to be able to rule those out before you diagnose ADHD. So make sure this person doesn't really have an anxiety disorder, or make sure there's not something else medical going on that could account for their hyperactivity. So we as psychologists are primed for that, but I don't think every healthcare professional is necessarily, because if that's not their specialty area, they're not necessarily attending to that. And the general public certainly isn't expected to know that. So I think that educating more will really help in terms of overdiagnosis.